Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. It's been a minute since I did any content on any new game releases on this channel. In fact, the last one was the Bottomless Pit number 61, which was about seasons, a lovely indie game that came out early this year. And now that I think about it, this is literally the first time in my life where I'm not clearing games back to back to back like I always did. I guess this is what it finally feels like to be an adult. In any case, since I've had to become a bit more choosy, I chose one of my most anticipated games this year, which is Final Fantasy 16. It's always an exciting time to get a new Final Fantasy release. Historically, they've always raised the bar of what is possible in the realm of video games, and even to this day, they're some of my most treasured gaming experiences that I've ever had. However, Final Fantasy 13 and 15 were a bit rough around the edges. Not terrible games by any stretch of the imagination, but definitely hit or miss in some aspects. And let's not forget the disaster launch of Final Fantasy XIV back when it first shipped. But here we are today in 2023, and with each new trailer hyping up the release of Final Fantasy 16, I was just floored by how epic the game was shaping up to be. Honestly, it seemed kind of too good to be true. Lord knows by now we've had plenty of epic game trailers that kind of overhyped the game and ended up being a disappointment in the end. Now that being said, I got super intrigued when I learned that Square Enix's Creative Business Unit 3 was helming this project. For those who are unaware, that's the team led by Naoki Yoshida, otherwise known as Yoshi P, that beautiful human being who's an inspiration to all gamers and developers alike. Truly a remarkable leader that I am just enamored with. I did briefly mention that disaster flop of a launch for Final Fantasy XIV. Well, this team has been responsible for resurrecting that MMORPG and bringing it to new and incredible heights to the point where now it's regarded as one of the most respected gaming experiences, not just out of MMORPGs, but certainly in that category, but just in general, one of the most respected gaming experiences in modern times. It was no easy feat, and yet they've done it with flying colors. So to see that they're handling the next main Final Fantasy game, that's pretty exciting. Nonetheless, the team has massive shoes to fill, though I am relatively confident because they just seem to have this incredible creative wind in their sails. And for the most part, I think they absolutely knocked it out of the park with Final Fantasy 16. The introduction to this game is simply legendary. It is epic. The first 4-ish hours of the game go so hard, it's absolutely bananas. Of course, I don't want to go too much in detail in the story because I do think it's worth experiencing for yourselves, but let it be known that this introduction alone just puts most of the competition to shame and pretty much warrants a full entry price on its own. The level of production quality in here is just off the charts. What a powerful kickstart to the character's narrative arc. I was immediately hooked. This will almost certainly go down in my memory as not only one of my favorite Final Fantasy intros of the franchise, but really of any intro of any game of ever at this point. It was remarkable. And it's no small feat considering that in 2023, there's quite a bit of competition. I mean, look no further than the explosive intro of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, or the cinematic powerhouse of Baldur's Gate 3, a game that just launched roughly a week ago. Yeah. What a time to be alive for gamers. Anyways, I digress, as usual. Indeed, the story is quite the fire starter. But I was equally pleased by how balanced the narrative and gameplay is in this game. It's pretty much a 50-50 cut in the middle between gameplay and narrative. You'll experience lengthy, high-quality cinematic cutscenes filled with intimate character development moments paired with exploration and a blistering hack-and-slash combat. Now, the transition between those two states is rather abrupt. This isn't quite the next-gen, seamless cinematic to gameplay transitions as we've seen in the remarkable God of War games recently, though luckily both halves are mighty engaging, even if it does have a bit of an old-school approach to it. Now, speaking of the action, old-timers of the Final Fantasy series won't be strangers to the fact that each new entry in the series completely reinvents its gameplay foundation, which as far as I'm concerned is something that should be applauded. Yeah, these guys don't rest on their laurels. That's not something you could say about too many franchises, especially ones that have had this kind of resounding success for such a long time. In any case, Final Fantasy 16 has a distinct hack-and-slash gameplay that feels very reminiscent of the Devil May Cry series. I know that for a lot of people it maybe rubbed them the wrong way, at least from a distance, but for me that was never really a detriment. The action is easy to pick up and get into and helps drive the urgency of the narrative events surrounding the combat forward. And the visceral nature of the action is supremely satisfying to overcome the great challenges you'll encounter with flair and crushing power. It really is a sensational feeling to just plow through a wave of enemies in this game. However, the general mundane action in this game pales in comparison to the larger-than-life boss battles that you will find in Final Fantasy XVI. Lord have mercy! The scale and the exotic nature of these encounters are phenomenal. These are industry-defining highlights. Of course, I'm going to go as little in detail as possible because I don't want to spoil anything. That being said, the icons of Final Fantasy XVI, all classic names of summons that all Final Fantasy fans know intimately, have been treated with the highest of regard. They have been given a godlike presence that is simply jaw-dropping. They are absolute showstoppers, every last one of them. And before going any further, the graphics are pretty phenomenal. The character models and environments are simply stunning in their beauty, their intricate detail, and their variety. This is an extremely dense, high-quality, handcrafted experience that will undoubtedly be one of the visual highlights in gaming of the year 2023. There are countless breathtaking vistas to be found in the world of Valisthea. Now, as you can tell, I have plenty of love to gush all over Final Fantasy XVI, and I have more still to share before the video review is over. It truly is a remarkable game for so many reasons, but let nobody say that I'm just some Final Fantasy fanboy, because I do have quite a bit of constructive criticism to give. It's not all sunshine and roses. As much as I am enthralled by the action gameplay, I do think it could get quite repetitive actually. This is mostly true for like the first third of the game, which is actually a really long time before your skill set starts opening up. Until then, you're kind of stuck using the same abilities and combos ad nauseum. Eventually, the combat does transform into something quite flexible, varied, and exciting, but I'd be lying to you if I didn't admit that it felt very draining and redundant for way too long of a time. Additionally, I did find the ability tree to be a bit underwhelming. Don't get me wrong, the individual skills are super engaging and creative and look visually fantastic. But once I did choose my abilities, I saw very little change for a long time. As far as I can tell, this is the case for two main reasons. Number one, the rate at which you gain your ability points is quite slow, so it takes a long time before you can get any new abilities. And number two, a lot of the abilities are unlocked by default, so your only option is to upgrade them, which is useful, but they don't really meaningfully change the way you approach combat or any unique tactical situations. It's basically the same ability, just like with a little bit of a boost. It's appreciated, but it doesn't add much variety. And to add salt on the wound, once you've upgraded your ability, the only other option you have is to then master it, which costs a lot of ability points, which already is a problem. When you actually master the ability, it changes nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing about the way the ability behaves, apart from the fact where you can assign that ability to any other icon, which realistically won't be useful for most of the game. This is really like an end game content kind of thing. And also, it may never actually be useful to you because you might just decide to, well, keep those abilities on the same icon that you got it, so you won't even see any use to that. And while we're on this topic, I find that XP gain is also very stingy. Leveling up has always been a thoroughly exciting part about RPGs, but here it takes so long to happen and the benefits so minuscule that at this point I'm wondering, like, what is even the point? Now, with all that being said, by far the most egregious part of Final Fantasy XVI is its mission design. And by that I mean you'll be confronted with a veritable army of fetch quests, and they literally make up the bulk of the game. Apart from some notable exceptions, the vast majority of these are dull as ditch water. On a more positive aspect, I do buy into the idea of helping people out, which goes hand in hand with the narrative that's kind of building in the world. It really does support the narrative nicely, and I enjoy being the paragon that extends a helping hand to those in need. It is a nice sentiment, and I do admit, now having finished the game, I do think that the sum of these parts is much greater than their individual pieces. We don't actually get that reward until much later on into the game, and even then I think there's a lot of fat that could be trimmed, because it does weigh down the experience far too much. I wish I were exaggerating, but it literally feels like half of the game's pacing just drags ass because of this seemingly endless supply of fetch quests. And keep in mind, this isn't exclusively for the side quests. Many main quest missions also suffer from this equally. There's a violent contrast in quality between those epic, industry-defining narrative peaks and this mediocre filler content that we've exhausted years ago in too many other games. And if I may for a moment, this is more of a comedic anecdote, but throughout your questing, you'll be regularly presented with seals that you receive from NPC. These are essentially symbols that your character shows to other NPCs to gain favors or to gain access to areas that were previously blocked off to you. And I couldn't help but feel like a Boy Scout who's collecting badges from his various activities to then sew onto his backpack. I was amused early on in the game for this, but by the end it becomes absolute lunacy. Clive should be decked out from head to toe in badges. Anyway, once again, I digress. The final nail in the coffin has to go to the animations. As beautiful as the character models are, the animations are surprisingly wooden, and it only makes things worse that there's a consistent lip sync issue throughout most of the game. And yes, there are like lip sync offsets in many games, if not most games, but in a game that is so dialogue and cutscene heavy, it really does hurt it and honestly kind of breaks my immersion on a regular basis. It doesn't ruin the game for me, of course, and the main missions overall do fare much better, though they are not immune themselves, but the quality of side quests in particular suffers big time, and it's not like those guys need any more negative feedback at this point in time. So yeah, I definitely do think Final Fantasy 16 has its weaker moments, unfortunately. And for a minute, I was worried about the overall quality, but I'm happy to say that my fears were laid to rest quite definitely because the rest of the game is so overwhelmingly amazing. Highlight of this game is without question the story. And by the way, if you've never played a Final Fantasy game before, that's fine. They're all fully fleshed out and standalone experiences, so whichever one you start with, you're good to go. And this one clearly seems to draw a lot of inspiration from the Game of Thrones series. Though I will say that it never quite felt like a copycat, at least as far as I'm concerned. This is a complex narrative that spans years of layered political intrigue in a medieval fantasy setting plagued with warring kingdoms. All the while, there's a blight that is slowly eating away at the land, which, as you can imagine, doesn't make life any easier for the people of Valistia. I'm impressed by how the game tackles so many loaded subjects at the same time. You'll be exposed to the cruelty and reality of slavery, poverty, racism, all the while seeing the effects of the ongoing war. I particularly appreciate the chatter of the NPCs as you would pass them by. Their words would change throughout the game's progress and reflect the changing reality of the war and how it would impact their lives. But I'm happy to say that even though it has a very mature tone, it's not all doom and gloom. There's a major emphasis on honor, loyalty, friendship, brotherhood, love, and a deep reverence for true leadership. The story of Final Fantasy 16 is definitely one of tragedy, but it contains a powerful undercurrent of hope that is centered around building a self-sustaining community that values freedom above all else. Honestly, it's quite beautiful and inspiring. And of course, at the center of it all is an incredible, massive ensemble cast of rich characters. This may actually be one of my favorite cast of characters in any Final Fantasy game thus far. Clive is a solid protagonist. Maybe he's a bit too stoic for my taste, and he's not the only character that can get that negative feedback on, but he more than makes up for it in moral fiber. His narrative arc sees him grow tremendously throughout the entire experience, and I truly appreciate the way he quietly but confidently wields the responsibility of being a leader to his people. And we can't go a single step further before mentioning Cid. Though all Final Fantasy games are standalone experiences, as I mentioned a moment ago, there are some names that have a habit of coming back. Cid's incarnation this time around has been treated with nothing but reverence. This is a glorious and legendary version of Cid that will certainly go down as one of his best iterations, if not the best of any Final Fantasy game ever. I will not elaborate any further. You guys go check it out for yourselves. It is simply fantastic. And truly, I feel like I developed a genuine bond and relationship with all the characters in Final Fantasy 16. Beyond the main characters, of course, I was surprised by how meaningful my relationships were with vendors of all people in this game. Unlike so many other games where your vendors are basically faceless caricatures. Blacksmith Blackthorn, Karen the shopkeeper, and Old Tomes. Man, these are fantastic characters that I've really been through thick and thin with them. Honestly, the whole Hideaway crew feels like family at this point. And of course, there's also a solid cast of villains that pose a real threat, but that have their own moral complexities that make them feel like real people with their own flaws and motivations. Once again, some of those boss fight encounters are beyond epic. Bahamut and Odin, oh my god. Now, for such a dense narrative experience with so many names, history, religion, countries, and whatever, it can be a lot to keep in your mind at the same time, especially if you are busy and you come back like a week later. So we've all been there where we come back to the game and like, oh, who are these people again? That's why the new active lore feature is such a wonderful addition to the game. If ever you forget who a certain character is, you can always bring up this tool that will quickly and simply bring you up to speed on some very vital information. We've seen some games recently adopt some really important UX improvements for specifically gameplay and readability issues, which is fantastic and I'm all for it. But I dare say we haven't seen too much of a UX improvement for narrative things. So I do think that this is a new landmark in the realm of video games, and I'm curious curious to see where we go from here on out. Now, as for the soundtrack of Final Fantasy 16, a feature that has always been a defining element of the Final Fantasy games, I'll be honest, for like the first half of the game, the soundtrack was a bit invisible to me. I was just fully immersed in the world, and I wasn't really thinking of the soundtrack. Perhaps there are no specific tunes that are just so iconic that really stand out in my mind. And at the same time, it's kind of hard to compare to the old classics, because what Nobuo Uematsu did on those classic Final Fantasy games, even today, they're so instantly recognizable and iconic that go beyond the Final Fantasy franchise itself. Now, nonetheless, after having spent a lot of time with the game, I think the soundtrack's actually kind of a banger. There are many orchestral moments that go hand in hand with the epic nature of those boss battles. Yeah, those moments are truly glorious in every sense of the word. But there are also many delicate, melancholic piano vibes, especially in the second half of the game, that really struck a chord with me. So there's definitely quality to be found in the music here, but it's just not going to be a personal favorite of mine, I think. And finally, can we just all agree that Torgo is the best boy ever? Yeah, it's an incredibly exciting time to be a Final Fantasy fan. Creative Business Unit 3 seems to have a fire lit inside their soul with all the incredible work they've been doing on Final Fantasy 14, and they show no signs of slowing down with this latest iteration in the franchise with Final Fantasy 16. Like I said, though I do think that this game has its weaker points, most notably the abundance of fetch quests and the somewhat repetitive nature of the combat, that notwithstanding, the parts that are good are so overwhelmingly amazing, it's just shocking to me. The game just gets better and better and better, and the fire in its soul just burns brighter the deeper I get invested in the story. Once again, those trailers initially seemed too good to be true. Little did I know that this would just be a small slice of the epic nature that we're experiencing in this game. Yeah, this game wildly surpassed any expectations I had. Honestly, I am ranging anywhere between an 8 way up to a 9.5 actually. A bit of a wide range on this one, I know, a bit of a weird score, but god damn, I'll be damned if I wasn't just blown away by the end. This truly is a rise from ashes scenario, both symbolically for the franchise and literally in the message and the narrative arc of the game itself. I absolutely love how they use the Phoenix as a narrative element in this game. And this is perhaps a bit more on a personal note, but man, I could not have asked for a better game at this point in my life with a Phoenix of all things as a central element in this game. Hell yes! Final Fantasy has just gone full on Super Saiyan on us. Who would have thought? This is an absolute meteor strike of a game and a surefire Game of the Year contender. And that's gonna be all for today. As always, wishing you and your loved ones nothing but the best. Take care, and I'll talk to you as soon as I can.